In the summer of 2024, a senior official in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative opened a spreadsheet and discovered something that hadn't been said aloud in Washington for 3 decades. America's most powerful economic weapon had stopped working. The tariff, the blunt instrument that had shaped trade policy since Alexander Hamilton, had been neutralized, not by diplomacy, not by retaliation, but by something quieter, by logistics. For nearly 80 years, the global trading system operated on a single assumption, that the United States held veto power over economic geography. Washington decided which ports mattered, which shipping lanes stayed open, which currencies settled transactions. And when Washington wanted to punish or discipline a trading partner, it deployed tariffs, taxes on imports designed to raise costs, shrink market access, and force compliance. The threat alone was often enough. China, Mexico, the European Union, they all understood that tariffs meant pain. They meant supply chain paralysis. They meant lost revenue. So they negotiated, they adjusted, they complied. The system worked because there was no alternative. If you wanted access to American consumers, you had to play by American rules. The choke point was the border. The leverage was the tariff. And Washington controlled both. It didn't begin with a dramatic summit or a White House announcement. It began quietly in the spring of 2023 in a port city most Americans couldn't locate on a map. The port of Shanxi, Peru. Chinese state-owned companies had spent nearly 4 years building a deep-water megaport on the Pacific coast, 60 kilometers north of Lima. When it opened in late 2024, it became the first port in South America capable of docking the largest container ships in the world, vessels too big for the Panama Canal. The infrastructure wasn't designed for regional trade. It was designed to bypass the United States entirely. Goods manufactured in southern China could now be shipped directly to Peru, offloaded, and distributed across South America without ever touching a U.S. port or crossing a U.S. border. No tariffs, no customs inspections, no leverage. The message wasn't delivered in a press release. It was delivered in concrete and cranes. Washington had been writing tariff policy. Beijing had been writing geography. The scale becomes clear when you map the flows. Shanxi can handle up to 1 million containers annually. Shipping time from Shanghai to Peru drops from roughly 35 days to 23. That's a 12-day advantage over routes that previously relied on transshipment through Los Angeles or Long Beach. The port connects directly to a Chinese-financed railway network stretching east across the Andes into Brazil, linking the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. Soybeans from Mato Grosso, lithium from the Atacama Desert, copper from Chilean mines. None of it needs to pass through North American supply chains anymore. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, similar infrastructure had already come online. The China-Laos Railway opened in late 2021, connecting Kunming to Vientiane and extending south toward Thailand. Chinese goods move overland now, skipping the Malacca Strait entirely in some cases. In Eastern Europe, the China-Europe freight rail network, stretching from Chongqing to Duisburg, Germany, carried more than 1.6 million containers in 2023. These aren't symbolic projects, they're operational alternatives, and every new route is a tariff that never gets collected. This was never just about ports and railways, it was about rendering borders irrelevant. Once you see it in one place, you see it everywhere. In 2022, the China Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank committed over $30 billion to logistics infrastructure across the global south. Not factories, not technology parks, ports, railways, highways, dry ports in landlocked nations. The projects shared a common design philosophy: create redundancy, build alternatives, strip choke points of their power. In Africa, the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway connected Kenya's coast to its interior, reducing freight time from over 15 hours to under 5. In the Middle East, the expansion of Gwadar Port in Pakistan offered China a western outlet to the Arabian Sea, bypassing the South China Sea entirely. In Latin America, Chinese firms financed port upgrades in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. Each project quietly eroded the assumption that American markets were indispensable. Investors noticed, shipping companies rerouted, manufacturers recalculated, and Washington kept raising tariffs on goods that increasingly never arrived at American docks. The sequence unfolded like a long chess game played across 3 continents. Step 1, identify the most tariff-vulnerable supply chains: electronics, textiles, automotive components, agricultural exports. Step 2, finance alternative logistics infrastructure that bypasses U.S. customs jurisdiction, not through diplomacy, through construction contracts. Step 3. Attract third-party manufacturers by offering tariff-free access to non-U.S. markets. Vietnam, for example, became a hub not just for Chinese firms evading U.S. tariffs, but for European and Japanese companies seeking diversified export routes. Step 4. Build payment infrastructure that doesn't rely on dollar clearing. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, processed over 80 trillion yuan in 2023, allowing transactions to settle without touching the U.S. financial system. Step 5. Extend this model to energy. The Power of Siberia pipeline delivers Russian natural gas to northern China, bypassing sanctions and tariffs on liquefied natural gas shipments that would otherwise transit through U.S.-aligned ports. Step 6. Institutionalize the system. The Belt and Road Initiative didn't just build infrastructure, it created binding logistics agreements. Countries signed long-term port operating contracts, railway management deals, and customs harmonization treaties. These weren't symbolic partnerships. They were legal frameworks that made alternative routes the default, not the fallback. Every trade weapon has a counter. Washington's counter had always been financial pressure, cutting off access to dollar liquidity, freezing assets, sanctioning banks. But that veto power depended on two conditions: that alternatives were prohibitively expensive and that U.S. markets remained indispensable. Both conditions began to erode. Dollar clearing volume as a share of global trade declined from roughly 90% in 2001 to just over 80% by 2023. Not a collapse, but a crack. Meanwhile, U.S. consumer market share of global GDP fell below 24%. Still massive, but no longer singular. The European Union, ASEAN, and intra-Asian trade blocs grew faster. When Washington threatened secondary sanctions on banks facilitating yuan-denominated trade, those banks didn't retreat. They opened separate subsidiaries beyond U.S. jurisdiction. The sanctions had teeth only if the target needed access to New York. If the target could clear payments in Shanghai, Singapore, or Dubai, the threat became optional. The veto required dependency. Dependency required monopoly. And monopoly required that no alternative existed. Once the infrastructure was built, the monopoly was broken. For American consumers, the shift doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It arrives as a slow, grinding recalibration. Tariffs that were supposed to bring manufacturing back to Ohio and Michigan instead raised prices without reshoring jobs. A 25% tariff on Chinese steel was supposed to revive Rust Belt mills, but by 2024, Chinese steel was moving through Mexico and Vietnam, reclassified and re-exported, landing in Houston tariff-free under updated trade agreements. The jobs didn't return, the prices stayed high. Meanwhile, American ports began to lose volume. Long Beach and Los Angeles, once the gateway for Asian imports, saw container traffic flatten as shipments rerouted through Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico or directly to South American hubs. The revenue that funded port infrastructure, rail connections, and warehouse jobs started to drift elsewhere. In the agricultural sector, the pain was more direct. U.S. soybean exports to China collapsed after 2018 tariffs. Farmers were told the leverage would force concessions. Instead, Brazil expanded soy production, China signed long-term contracts with Brazilian exporters, and by 2023, the U.S. share of China's soybean imports had fallen below 30%. Iowa didn't get the leverage, it got the bill. The Midwest lost market share that won't come back because the supply chains have been redrawn. Tariffs were supposed to defend American industry. Instead, they accelerated its marginalization by giving competitors a reason to build permanent alternatives. A tariff only works if the target has no choice but to absorb it. Once infrastructure creates a choice, the weapon becomes a cost on both sides. When Washington raised tariffs on Chinese goods in 2018, the assumption was that Chinese exporters would either pay the tax or lose access to the U.S. market. For a few years, that assumption held, but by 2024, it no longer did. Chinese manufacturers had rerouted production through Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico. They had recalibrated export destinations toward Europe, Africa, and Latin America. They had moved up the value chain, selling not to American consumers, but to supply chains that no longer depended on American distribution networks. The tariff still existed, but the goods it targeted were no longer arriving. The leverage had evaporated because the trade flows had been redesigned. Meanwhile, American manufacturers dependent on Chinese inputs, rare earth elements, semiconductors, battery components, faced higher costs with no domestic alternative. The tariff didn't protect them. It trapped them. And when Washington tried to respond by subsidizing domestic production, it discovered that supply chains aren't rebuilt with tax credits. They're rebuilt with decades of patient infrastructure investment that had already been made elsewhere. Here's what this moment reveals about the new logic of economic power. First, infrastructure is foreign policy. The country that builds the ports, railways, and payment systems writes the rules, not through diplomacy, but through the default settings of global logistics. Second, tariffs are only as powerful as the choke points they defend. Once alternative routes exist, the tariff becomes a tax on your own economy, not a weapon against another. Third, leverage requires dependency, and dependency requires monopoly. The moment a second option appears, monopoly collapses, and so does the leverage. Fourth, the United States spent 2 decades treating trade policy as a negotiating tool. Its competitors spent the same 2 decades treating logistics as a civilizational project. The gap between those approaches is now measurable in container throughput and railway tonnage. Fifth, economic power isn't rhetorical, it's operational. It doesn't matter what Washington announces if the ships are docking elsewhere. Sixth, the global South is no longer a theater for great power competition. It's becoming the infrastructure that decides who wins. And seventh, the countries that control the alternatives don't need to defeat American policy. They just need to make it irrelevant. So here's the question. Washington hasn't answered yet. What do you do when your most powerful weapon stops working? Not because it was defeated, but because the world built a detour around it. The tariff isn't obsolete, it's optional. And optional tools don't command respect. They invite circumvention. The irony is almost poetic. For decades, the United States defended free trade when it served American interests and deployed tariffs when it didn't. Now, the rest of the world has adopted the same logic and built the infrastructure to make it work. The trade war isn't over. It's just being fought on terrain. Washington no longer controls. The ports are operational. The railways are running. The payment systems are clearing. And somewhere in a conference room in Washington, someone is still adjusting tariff rates, believing it will change the outcome. It won't. If this kind of analysis matters to you, if you want to understand the infrastructure behind the headlines, subscribe, because the next shift is already being built. And it won't announce itself with a press release either.